Welcome everyone to our webinar on carbon taxation. I wanted to first just make it clear that this meeting, unlike many of the ones we organize, is going to be recorded, so it's on the record. This is because it can be a resource going forward that we will keep on our website for the governments in the group. So with this session today, we are launching a new series for the new producers group. So as you'll know, in the last year when COVID began, we had organized a series of webinars and discussions on fostering resilience in crisis. And that was about, responding to the crisis and building resilience and in our response systems and policies, but it was really more about making sense of the uncertainty and the crisis that was unfolding. And so now, 1 year on, I think we're really ready to take the next step, which is what this series will be about, and that's called Forging a New Path. And what we're doing here is thinking about what's specific about emerging oil and gas producers is that unlike established exporting oil and gas countries, emerging producers are at the start gate. They're at the start gate just as energy systems are starting to decarbonize, and there are big transformations underway. So being at the start gate presents some disadvantages clearly, because now the development of the petroleum sector is time bound in a way that it wasn't before. But there are some advantages, and those are related to the fact that emerging oil and gas producers are not locked in to carbon intensive development paths. You haven't had sort of structural inefficiencies related to the consumption of gasoline or energy. You don't have subsidies because you're importing, or you may have subsidies, but you're not subsidizing your own production in a way that increases consumption. You don't have a whole petroleum value chain. And you don't have the kind of the use of revenues that an established producer would have, that creates also those inefficiencies and perhaps less of a concern for this is a limited pot of money and we have to be very careful with how we use it. So I think it's really about forging a new path, is about how emerging producers can do things differently, and how they can build systems, build their policies to be more resilient to the changes that are ongoing in the energy world and beyond. So what does that mean? Building better is one of, if you think of the session we have today, it's really about how carbon taxation is emerging as a new issue, a new constraint for oil and gas trade, but also as an opportunity in that it can be an incentive for the kind of investment that you would want in the country. And so we'll be looking at that from both angles in this session. Also, to say that this session is not only launching that new series, it's also the first of 3 webinars that we are organizing ahead of a training course that we're delivering at the end of the month from the 28th of June on aligning petroleum sector goals with climate policy and climate goals, environment goals, energy access goals, and development, the development vision. And so this course for this course, we've selected a limited number of countries to participate. So we have Suriname, Guyana, Uganda, Lebanon, and Somalia. But the webinars and the pre-course viewing that we're organizing for that is open to the whole group and beyond, because I think it's just useful resources for the benefit of the whole group. So for those of you who are not so familiar with the New Producers Group, I should just say that it's composed of 30 countries that are at the exploration stage, the post-discovery development stage, and early production. And it's really based on peer-to-peer exchange and sharing challenges in policy design and implementation across governments at different stages of development of the resource, but with some commonality really in the experience. So today I'm delighted that we have two wonderful speakers to share their experience on carbon taxation. First, we have Tatiana Falcão, tax lawyer and advisor for the high-level panel on international financial accountability, transparency, and integrity for achieving the 2030 agenda. And we have Dr. Machingambi, who is a senior economist for environmental and fuel taxes at the National Treasury of South Africa. So we'll hear from Tatiana a bit about the international issues related to carbon taxation and carbon pricing. And then with Memory, we'll hear more about the national application and what this meant, you know, how this was sort of implemented at a national level in South Africa. So without further, just to say, we will have both presentations. I think I'll have maybe some questions in between the two presentations, but we'll have time for Q&A after they speak. So you can ask questions at any time in the chat, and of course after they've spoken. So Tatiana, over to you. Thank you.
So today I'll be talking about a little bit about carbon taxation in general. So from a theoretical perspective, I have a little bit of an ambitious agenda here. So I'll try to slide through these topics to give you a flavor of the topic, and then we can have some questions at the end if you have any. So I'll start with a little bit of background on the existing international environmental agreements, explain why COVID-19 has provided a momentum for change for the application of general carbon pricing approaches in general, but also for the application of carbon taxes. Then I make the distinction between carbon pricing mechanisms, and what does it imply to refer to carbon pricing in general. And then we adopt more of a focused approach on carbon taxation, and we go through the legal definition of what is considered to be an environmental tax and an environmentally related tax. And there is soft law instruments coming from the UN about now, so that will be a good indicative. Legal design of carbon taxation. I will talk very briefly about border tax adjustments and their role in carbon taxes. But also carbon pricing in general, climate clubs and regionalism and the potential for countries to interact with each other in order to form more cohesive approaches to carbon taxation. Multilateralism, which is kind of forward-looking topic since there is as of yet no agreement on a multilateral approach, and then the forecast and what we can expect to see going forward. So that's the agenda for today, and I will start on it because it's quite extensive, as I said. So 2015 was actually a little bit of a landmark year for environmental protection, because it was a year where several agreements were concluded at the UN level, starting with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which established the sustainable goals that you probably are all aware of. There was the Addis Ababa Agenda that contained the foundation for financing the 2030 Agenda, and that includes, you know, carbon pricing mechanisms within it. And then, of course, there was the Paris Agreement that was also introduced in 2015. And brought about the possibility for countries to employ not just a market-based approach as had been recognized under the Kyoto Protocol, but also carbon taxing mechanisms and other financing mechanisms to address environmental concerns in general, like green bonds and you know, blended finance and all these other more investment-related instruments. So just to put it into context, at the level of the SDGs, which are supposed to be met in 2030, there are at least 9 SDGs that deal directly or indirectly with climate protection, even though there is a specific SDG that delves on climate action, which is SDG 13. But if you look at the other ones, you see that many of them, you know, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, sustainable cities and communities, they all, to some extent, will deal with an element of environmental protection. So it's actually something that is inbuilt into many of these targets for 2030. So what caused this legal momentum for change, and why are we now talking so much about carbon taxation and carbon pricing in general? First of all, it's actually the context and the agreements, the Paris agreements, the finalization of the Paris agreements. So it all started in 1992 with UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that kind of is the umbrella convention for all the other environmental conventions that came later. In 1997, already we had an agreement on the Kyoto Protocol, and the Kyoto Protocol was kind of an attempt to say, under the umbrella convention of the UNFCCC, what are we going to do in terms of carbon pricing? So countries tried to come together into an agreement on what they saw as feasible in terms of pricing carbon. So pricing the externality, so to speak. The agreement that they achieved, and you see it in the negotiating papers, is the Kyoto Protocol, which is a market-based approach. The negotiating papers showcase that the preferable option would have been for a carbon tax, but they couldn't get a consensus-based approach on a carbon tax. So they went for a market-based approach, which was the approach that was employed in the Kyoto Protocol, which only provided for a binding commitment from certain countries that were denominated Annex 1 countries, which are generally developed countries. And that's probably the reason why the Kyoto Protocol in general and the emissions trading schemes that followed following the Kyoto Protocol approach failed to achieve a high enough price for carbon, that because it's demonstrated that unless we achieve a level of commitment from the global commons, we're not actually going to be able to establish a high enough price on carbon. And that's because of carbon leakage concerns. So the countries that actually decide to employ carbon taxes or carbon prices, they will never be able to achieve such a high level of taxation or pricing, because they will always be concerned that the countries next door will not be employing those taxes, and therefore they will assign mechanisms in order to reduce the burden on their domestic industries, and that ultimately leads to a kind of a race to the bottom approach. But then, aware of that, in 2015, countries finally were able to agree on the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement is kind of a comeback to the UNFCCC basic principles, and it kind of expands the array of policies available to countries in order to address climate concerns, extending it beyond just market-based approaches, but also including carbon taxes, like I said, financial instruments like green bonds, blending instruments, and other, approaches that can be employed by private partners and by financial partners in order to achieve a direct or an indirect price on carbon. So, the Paris Agreement, of course, that was all allowed before the Paris Agreement, but, it kind of formalizes the fact that countries can employ different approaches in order to achieve a direct and an indirect price on carbon. So this was all magnified in 2020 with the outbreak of the COVID crisis. And that's because, in 2020, we had again the world going into another area of recession, period of recession, and countries were faced with the challenge of having to recover from this recession in a way that is sustainable in order to meet the 2030 targets, but also to have because of the extensive spending in order to help citizens cope with the pandemic, and with the best practices in dealing with the pandemic, which basically means that people were stranded in their own households. Countries will have to accumulate greater resources in order to be able to drive the economy forward following the COVID pandemic. So a number of international organizations have included carbon taxation and carbon pricing techniques within their agendas. especially with the need in order to recover from this recessionary environment. I have a quote there from Kristina Georgieva, which is the managing director of the IMF, and the IMF has extensively provided funds for governments across the world to try to recover from this recessionary environment. And nowadays, many of these loans that are being provided by the IPs, they are contingent on the adoption of sustainable development practices, which include the establishment of carbon pricing techniques. So you have a little bit of a magnified picture of carbon pricing across the globe there. It is not super widespread, but it's starting to take shape. And you see that the leading economies across the world have actually already employed some form of carbon pricing technique, with very little in Africa. And very little in the US. The US only has regional state approaches, but with the election of the Biden administration, it has been put forward in the media that they intend to change that, and they intend to adopt a more stable national-wide carbon pricing approach.
Tatiana, so what is can you, just for the previous map, could you just tell people what ETS is?
ETS is emissions trading system. So that's what it stands for. I will cover that in my next slide, actually. I will tell you the difference. It's the main mechanism for the employment of a market-based approach. So what is understood by carbon pricing, I'm always talking about carbon taxes and carbon pricing differently, and I'm making the distinction, and that's actually meant to be a distinction, because carbon pricing covers both market-based mechanisms, which are emissions trading systems, which are kind of, if you will, a market for the negotiation of permits that provide you the right to pollute the environment. So these are like, they function almost like stock exchange markets. And usually under an ETS scheme, a government will give you, will distribute to certain covered entities. So entities within the scope of the ETS, which are usually the energy intensive industries, they will distribute permits that give you the right to pollute. They will either distribute them for free or they will auction them. And that means almost like a tax, but they're selling them. So it's an auction that provides them with the right of the permits. The companies can then use those permits in order to pollute in the normal administration of their businesses. Or if they don't use all of the allocations that were conferred to them, they then negotiate them in an emissions trading market, which is a kind of a stock exchange market where, the price will be higher depending on the laws of offer and demand, and lower if nobody's interested in buying those rights to pollute. So that's how it works. It is a more complex system than the establishment of a carbon tax, because of course, for a country to introduce an ETS, it requires extensive research on their main industries' polluting ability. They have to know emissions patterns. So it takes a long time, and on average, it takes about 5 to 10 years for countries to actually introduce ETS schemes. And so that's why, from a developing country perspective, it's usually recommended to start with the carbon tax because it's more easily implementable. It can be, introduced as fast as the government can, negotiate a bill within Parliament and have it accepted by its electorates. And so it's much more easy because it's just a mechanism that is part of the legal process. So when I talk about carbon pricing, I actually reference both carbon taxing and carbon pricing and market-based approaches, which are the two main instruments that provide an explicit price on carbon. Why? Because to the extent that the permits are auctioned in an ETS system, it's an explicit price on carbon because it's the government establishing how much the right to pollute will be worth. And so it's almost equivalent to a carbon tax. And a carbon tax, obviously, to the extent that you impose a price on carbon. So it's usually measured per tons of carbon dioxide emissions, and it's the inbuilt emissions in the raw material contained in the crude oil. then you automatically make a correlation between a product's capacity to pollute and the emissions that will be generated in the downstream level. I will go into more detail in that. So I have other slides that will explain this better. So the difference being whether it's an explicit price or an implicit price on carbon, the fact that ETS still, like, we usually use the European ETS as the standard benchmark for comparison with other market-based approaches. It still allows about 50% of the permits to be allocated for free. And so it means that for those permits that are allocated for free, and that's because of competition issues and concerns of carbon leakage, for those permits, the price is only implicit, because it'll be whatever price is determined when the permits and if the permits are negotiated in the markets. Energy taxation and fuel taxation can also be used as a form of addressing carbon pricing, but it's again an inbuilt price of carbon, because it's not a direct correlation between the product's ability to pollute and the emissions that are generated at the end. It's kind of an approximation based on mathematical computation. And again, these mechanisms, they're very effective at generating public revenues, some more than others. So carbon taxes are more effective than market-based approaches are, basically because governments can control the level of taxation employed, whereas in the ETS, the control is not so straightforward because of the main differentiation between under an ETS, you put a cap on the number of emissions, and then you establish the corresponding, and you allow the market to establish the corresponding price. Whereas in a tax, you actually price, you actually price the carbon upfront, and then the market will be responsible for diminishing the amount of emissions based on this economic incentive to reduce emissions and to choose for the least polluting product. So, you know, they're kind of, I usually have a slide that explains that how they are kind of parallel in achieving the same results, but they do it through different ways. So just briefly on the conceptual approach, because I understand that many of you interested in introducing a carbon tax might be worried how it would fit into a legal framework. There are three levels, I would say even two levels of definitions that are of interest. One is environmentally related taxes, and the other is environmental taxes. And then within the context of environmental taxes are included the carbon taxes. So it's like kind of a subgenre of the environmental tax species. So I'll go through these in more detail. So environmentally related taxes are any compulsory unrequited payment to general governments levied on tax bases deemed to be of particular environmental relevance. So that's anything that is related to the environment, right? So this could be like a fee for the licensing of vehicles that will cause an impact on the land per weight of vehicle. It's not necessarily attached to the pollution produced. There might not be necessarily a direct link between what the tax is about and the impact that is ultimately generated in the environment. This is a more broad-based approach as to anything that is environmentally related. So it's quite a loose kind of definition. Then a little bit less loose is the definition of environmental taxes, which brings about the need for an actual environmental effect. So environmental taxes are taxes whose tax base is a physical unit or a proxy that has a proven specific negative impact for the environment. So there in the definition of environmental taxes, we're actually trying to obtain a direct impact on the environment, meaning that it's not just any tax, it's a tax where you can verify that there has been an actual environmental gain resulting from the imposition of a tax. And the typical example is the carbon dioxide tax, a carbon tax, because you can have that direct effect. So carbon tax is a tax capable of conferring a reduction in corresponding carbon-based equivalent emissions in the atmosphere. and it is thus regarded to have environmental purpose and effect. And that's the last line is very important, that the tax is employed having an environmental purpose in mind, that is the reduction of carbon emissions, and it causes an environmental effect. So it's not just a revenue raiser, it's actually a tax that means to provide for an environmental gain. And all this distinction and then these definitions, they weren't anywhere else. They were scattered across several publications, across soft law instruments. But we brought them together in a UN handbook on carbon taxation that is being published over the summer, over the Northern Hemisphere summer. So June, July, it's expected to come out in July. The definition of a carbon tax is actually novel. It's something that the Subcommittee on Environmental Taxation that is attached to the Tax Committee of Experts agreed on. But the definition for environmentally related as opposed to environmental taxes was extracted from existing publications from the OECD. And the OECD was part of the Subcommittee on Environmental Taxation, meaning that there was an agreement from the part of the international organizations on these classifications, which is very important if you're, working with the legality of the instruments and trying to match them to your legal framework in introducing a carbon tax.
Tatiana, I just wanted to signpost that you have about 10 minutes left, and I just want to make sure that you have time to go eventually to the slide on border tax adjustments. I think would be just not to lose that one.
Right, so we'll go very quickly through these and try to concentrate a little bit more on the design. So what are the objectives pursued via the carbon tax? I think I've already mentioned that. One is the reduction of carbon dioxide emissions. So it's an environmental purpose, but there's also a gain to be had from a government perspective in generating public revenues. And then there is an intrinsic conundrum that I like to talk about because it's a question that is always put forward, in that the successful application of the tax will necessarily lead to a reduction in a country's revenue generation ability, meaning over time, if you're very successful and you achieve the behavioral change that you expect through the application of the tax, people will choose to consume the least emissions intensive product, and therefore you automatically get a reduction in revenue accumulation ability. Having said that, that takes a very long time to happen, so it's not something that you should be worried about to start with. To start with, the important thing is to employ a carbon tax. So in terms of legal design, what is a carbon tax? So it's a specific tax, meaning it's a price on a ton of carbon. And it's levied on fossil fuels by weight or volume, or on an actual emission if applied at the downstream level. So there are two levels at which the tax can be applied. At the upstream level, and I will show you here a little diagram to exemplify that. So upstream is really at the extraction point, if you're an extractive industry, and I think most of you are listening to this call. So it's really at the level of extraction of the oil well. Some countries employ it at the first level of processing domestically. That's also possible. Or at import for resource poor countries, or for countries that need to rely on a variety of different qualities of oil and only have one or two varieties of qualities of oil available domestically. So it can either be applied at the extraction level or as close as possible to extraction point, or at import level. Downstream is basically interpreted in different ways. Some people interpret it as downstream as being what is explained here as midstream. So actually oil refinery level or processing plants. And that was the case in Chile, for example. They consider processing plants to be applied downstream. I think the South African example, which we'll hear about next, is also a downstream tax. And the benefit of a downstream tax is that you can actually use the tax in order to verify what your emissions are at national level, and eventually develop an emissions trading market or an emissions trading scheme down the line, because you start getting data from the industry over time. So it's an excise tax. So it's simple to employ and it's straightforward. The tax base is an item of pollution. So it's usually expressed as a price per ton of carbon. So most countries employ, let's say, $30 per ton of carbon. That's the baseline around Europe. In Latin America, the baseline is around $5 per ton of carbon. So it'll change depending on the level of development within a country. The objective is to inflict change in consumer behavior. So if you think about it, diesel is more carbon intensive than gasoline, and gasoline is more carbon intensive than natural gas. And so by employing a tax of $10 per ton of carbon dioxide emissions, you are providing an economic stimulus for the consumer to purchase natural gas over diesel, because diesel will be more heavily impacted. It will have more carbon content, and therefore it will be more expensive than the natural gas. And that's the main workings of the tax. And then there is a question with respect to earmarking and revenue use, how you will employ those revenues, and that's dependent on whether your legal framework and you have any constitutional constraints to earmarking domestically. So I think I've covered that, so I won't spend any more time. So what is the best practices for global price setting? With the initial price is whatever price is admissible from your domestic perspective. We usually say that any price is better than no price. So from a tax perspective, start with a tax. Usually countries start with a low tax. Let's say Latin American countries, which are probably the closest examples to our public today, they employ roughly $5 per ton of carbon. It is still a message to your consumer public that you have a carbon pricing mechanism that is intended to make people change their consumer behavior, and so it works pretty well. The idea is that the initial legislation introducing the carbon tax over time already foresees how that tax will increase, and it should foresee tax rate increases over a span of at least 50 years, because oil and gas investments are very long investments, and therefore it would give stability to your investor to know that his burden will increase over time, that his cost will increase over time. It's important to have publicity in policy making. And that again provides the investors with the ability to know that they are participating in the process of establishing a carbon tax, that it's predictable how their costs will increase over time, and also for the taxpayer in general, for them to participate in this introduction process in order to gain public acceptance of the tax domestically. And I think memory will have a lot to speak to that, because South Africa took a very long time to introduce a carbon tax, and that was mainly because they were doing these conversing with their taxpayers, in fact, to make the legislation be acceptable by the general public. And so here I have a slide
Tatiana, just to flag that you have about 3-4 minutes left. So just to, okay, I'd love to be able to cover
So here I have a slide that actually explains to you what the levels of carbon tax rate are across the world. It covers market-based approaches as well. But if you have time later, you can go through these and see how different countries have employed carbon taxes over time. And I think the message to take from that slide is that the highest tax rates are those that are employed for the longest time periods. And so if you start with a low tax rate and you progress it over time, Sweden is the highest taxing country. And they started in the 90s. So there's a reason why they employ such high levels of tax. And that's because they have a long history with the application of carbon taxes. So just to provide you a word about border tax adjustments, I've referred in the start to carbon leakage. And what is carbon leakage? Is the potential for businesses to relocate to the country next door or across the ocean in order to get lower cost for their businesses. And that's because in theory, the other country wouldn't be employing a carbon tax, and then therefore they would be less burdened by the tax. There are several reasons why resource-rich countries should not be worried about it. First of all, is that there was a long time of money and investment devoted to finding the oil in your jurisdictions, and oil is usually concentrated in a specific geographic location, meaning, you know, industries, extractive industries particularly, will not relocate because of the imposition of a carbon tax. There are several extractive industries that are well settled in countries that employ carbon taxes, like Norway, Colombia, which also has a carbon tax. Chile has a carbon tax. Mexico has a carbon tax. These are all extractive industry countries. So you know, it takes a lot of effort and a lot of cost for an industry to relocate as well. So leakage it's put forward as a concern by many countries, but it requires quite a high carbon tax rate in order for countries for companies to actually relocate because of the carbon tax. So yeah, if there is relocation, it will lead to loss of domestic economic activity, and that's something that countries are concerned about, and that's why the EU market-based approach also provides for free allocation of permits, aware that industries could relocate to countries where the cost is lower. But how do you avoid carbon leakage, and how do you account for competitiveness concerns of those industries that actually negotiate? So if you think of the midstream level, steel production producers, pulp, cement producers, these are all industries that are very energy intensive. They're usually the industries that would be covered by an emissions trading scheme. And these are industries that will likely be very affected by a carbon tax or a carbon price. So how do you make sure that these industries are still able to compete internationally in international markets without losing their competitiveness? Competing in equal terms to all their international partners. So that's where border tax adjustments come in. That's a price that is employed at the border, and it functions like a price that should be equivalent to the domestic equivalent of the carbon price. So if it's a carbon tax that you employ domestically of $5, your border tax adjustment would be of $5. And that's just, you know, applying a price towards the products that are imported into your economy, so that both the imported product and the domestic product are incurring to the same cost of production. And bear the same polluter pays principle. What you do then when these products are destined to be exported and destined for international markets is, in theory, because it's never been employed, and the European Union is actually the first one to be attempting to employ this towards an environmental excise tax, is that you then apply an export border tax adjustment, and you basically credit back the tax that was employed domestically, so that the product can be exported at what would be the normal business as usual price before there was a carbon taxing methodology. So then it's as if the carbon tax never existed, because you're giving back the amount of the tax. All this is subject to verification under the World Trade Organization. It's subject to the provisions of the GATT, which is the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. There is indication to say that the WTO would be favorable to the application of environmental taxes in general. And that's a general conclusion. It would fit under the exception of the GATT, which is contained in Article 20. But as this has never been tested, it's not, you know, we cannot really say that it would not be subject to any dispute under the WTO. The application of the border tax adjustment, the application of the carbon tax is not a contentious issue, and you can start right now employing carbon taxes, as many countries have, and you wouldn't have any issues domestically or internationally. So if I have any more time, I can go into climate clubs. Otherwise, I'll stop here, because then I'll go into more of a multilateral approach.
Well, I think probably we should stop here, because I think what we will do is make the slides available to the participants, and so they can find out more by reading through them at their leisure. I think what you've laid out here is really like an excellent explainer on carbon tax, and really instructive for me. So I think maybe now a good segue would be to go into the national implementation by South Africa. But before we do that, I wanted to check if there are any questions on clarification points. We can have like a proper discussion after the second presentation, because I have a number of questions as well for you. But if I don't see any questions or in the chat, I'll assume that we can go to memory.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Well, it's afternoon in South Africa, everyone. I'm just going to share our carbon tax journey, which unfortunately, unlike what Tatiana said, took us 10 years to actually implement. So I'm just going to go through the policy context in terms of why South Africa decided to go the carbon tax route, and why the design criteria that we looked at, and what are the features of our carbon tax, and just share some challenges and lessons learned. As some of you are considering implementing carbon taxes, what you could expect in the journey. So in terms of the South African landscape, so we are in a bit of a quandary. We're a developing nation, but almost 85% of our electricity is coal-generated. So in terms of ranking of our absolute greenhouse gas emissions, we're ranked very high. We're ranked 14th. And in terms of our per capita emissions, we ranked even higher. We do worse than other developed countries. So in this particular slide, what I'm just showing is our latest the 2015 greenhouse gas inventory. This is the latest publicly available one. So if you look at it, the way we price our emissions, which Tatiana alluded to. So I think we're the only country that prices the tax based on the emissions. We do it sort of midstream. So we follow the IPCC code of activities. And if you look at this inventory, you'll see that the code 1, which is energy combustion, is the largest source of our greenhouse gas emissions because of coal electricity generation. And because of that, we have very concentrated emissions in the system. So that also played into the instrument of choice that we decided on as a country. And so the carbon tax is imposed in terms of energy combustion, fugitive emissions. So we also look at upstream in terms of the fugitive emissions that come from drilling oil and gas on the offshore for us. And also we price industrial processes emissions, and we don't price our agriculture, forest, and other land use, and the waste sector emissions are not priced under the carbon tax. The reason being, when we mooted the idea of a carbon tax, the measurements and robust methodologies were not very available for those two sectors. So it is hard for you to implement a tax on emissions that you can't allocate, especially in the AFOLU sector. So in terms of our policy context, we gave a voluntary commitment at COP15, which actually formed the basis of our NDC and NDC that we've submitted under the Paris Agreement. And currently, we're looking at, we're reviewing actually the NDC. So it's out for public comment, where we're looking at actually strengthening or I guess, reducing the target we have, because we've got an emissions range that we have submitted to the UNFCCC. And so in terms of national policy, we have what's called the National Development Plan that actually sets out the priorities of government and the policies that we need to implement for us to transition to an economy, because we are, I think for those that don't know, we are one of those economies that have a really high level of inequality. So we face inequality, poverty, and unemployment, and that plays into the policies that we implement. And then in 2011, we implemented a national climate change response policy that provides the framework of all how as a country we respond to in terms of mitigation and adaptation. So it lays out all the instruments that we're going to use as a country. And within that national climate change response policy, there is provision for us to price carbon. And as Tatiana indicated, it could have been an emissions trading scheme or a carbon tax. So in terms of the policies, the first table I showed you, our emissions are very concentrated. So as a country, when you want to implement an emissions trading scheme, you need a number of players in the system. For us, because our emissions are very concentrated, we've got like 4 very big producers of emissions, and the rest are very small, and there's a small number of them. So an emissions trading scheme would not have worked as efficiently at that time when we wanted to implement a carbon pricing tool. So in terms of the policy mix, we have implemented the sort of energy efficiency tax incentives just for us to unlock, the cheap abatement. And our carbon tax, I think, is regarded, it actually covers, it's an economy-wide tax. So it actually covers a broader range of sectors than even the EU ETS. And the reason why we implemented the tax is just for us to provide that price signal and unlock the mitigation potential within the country. And now we're looking at some policies on the technology side. As the carbon tax, we're hoping to increase the level of the tax so that we actually unlock the technologies that can be implemented alongside carbon pricing. So I've talked to the policy rationale. I guess the reason why as a country we went for a carbon tax and not an emissions trading scheme. And I think also, judging from literature, there's a whole lot of support for a carbon price because it is economically effective. And it also sort of provides that signal where you start to get your sectors thinking about the future, because with the implementation of the Paris Agreement, there is going to be a requirement for even the developing countries to actually mitigate very quickly. Tatiana talked to the carbon border adjustments that the EU is being the one that has come forward and said they want to implement. But the debate actually now is the US, Canada, they've also indicated that they are working on the carbon border adjustments. So as we go forward, there is a need for us to price, I guess, our emissions so we don't suffer from the cost impacts of those carbon border adjustments. And it also gets our economies to move from the more carbon intensive to the lower carbon intensive production. So this just shows, I guess, the policy process that we've gone through. So after the, implementation of the long-term mitigation strategy in 2007, where there was modeling done that informed the COP15 voluntary commitment we made, then the Treasury started talking about a carbon tax. So we've had to publish, we published a discussion paper that we consulted on. And then after that, we had to publish a policy paper that we consulted on. And after we had done the policy paper, then we published the design of the tax. And then we started then the parliamentary process to get the different, we had 2 sets of bills that went through Parliament. And finally, we got the tax. It was only implemented on 1 June 2019. And alongside the tax, so the way we've designed our tax is we've also implemented a number of incentives within it for us to incentivize mitigation. I indicated that our FOLU and our waste sectors are not covered by the carbon tax. So we've implemented a carbon offset scheme for us to incentivize mitigation in those particular sectors. So you can develop your carbon offsets project in those particular sectors and use the emissions reductions to reduce your taxable emissions. So in terms of the different incentives that we also have regulations, which we finalized in June 2020. So this talks to the design of the tax, which I think Tatiana talked about how you design environmentally related tax, because the carbon tax is part of those environmentally related tax. So for us, we are pricing an externality, and our tax rate is very low. I think we started at about 120 Rand, which is about $8 per ton. And the reason being, we sort of wanting to phase in. We don't want to shock the economy. We want to give our industry time to transition. And in addition to the low tax rate, we also went for a carbon tax because of our strong tax system. It's much easier to implement an instrument that sort of piggybacks on the systems that you have. So we've got a very strong excise taxation system that we piggybacked on. And in designing this tax, we also looked at the competitiveness impacts, because it was in the making for 10 years. When we started, a lot of jurisdictions were not pricing their carbon. There weren't a lot of even the emissions trading schemes. So we had to implement a trade exposure allowance within the tax design for us to mitigate the impacts, to make sure we're not prejudicing our industry. So we've got a trade proxy, which is your exports plus your imports over your total production. And this applies on the sectoral level. So if a company is within a sector, even if you're not trade exposed, the fact that your sector is trade exposed gives you that advantage. And then we also looked at the distributional impacts, and we made concessions. So that's something you have to keep in mind. If you're going to price, you need to be prepared to make compromises just so you can get the instrument into place, and also make sure you cushion the low income households, because with the carbon tax or carbon price, it's going to affect your energy prices. So we made a compromise in terms of what we call electricity price neutrality. So the electricity generators in South Africa, if they buy renewable energy from independent power producers, they can use that cost can be offset against their tax liability. And we also have an environmental levy we implemented. It was a demand side levy in 2008 when we started having blackouts, just for us to manage demand. So it applies to electricity generators who use fossil fuels and nuclear. So they can use that cost also to reduce their carbon tax liability. The reason being, we didn't want to have an impact on electricity pricing during the first phase. So that's one of the big compromises, and also a distribution impact, I guess, allowance we had to make. And you also need to look at the adjoining policy areas. When you price or your carbon, how does it fit in with, for example, I know in Africa, a lot of countries implement fuel taxes. How do you harmonize your carbon price with those particular taxes? Or if you have any other, for example, in South Africa, we've got a motor vehicle emissions tax that applies when you, at the point of purchase, when you're buying a car. If you're buying a very emissions intensive car, you pay a certain amount above a certain threshold. So we tried to harmonize that with the carbon tax design. Then in terms of the carbon tax policy framework, we follow, so as a country, we've got an emissions reporting, a mandatory emissions reporting requirement for companies. For the different activities, there are thresholds for combustion, but for process and fugitive, there are no thresholds. So because in terms of that, we follow the reporting, that mandatory reporting thresholds. And if you are above the threshold, then the tax will apply to you. And we price all the 6 Kyoto gases, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and sulfur, whatever, but we impose it as a carbon dioxide equivalent tax. And it started at 120 rands, which was about $8 US. It increases by inflation +2 for the first phase and inflationary afterwards, because I think Tatiana indicated when you're putting a price, which is the carbon tax, you need to provide certainty to the market. And one of the certainty we needed to provide to industry was how we're going to change the carbon price going forward. And we don't earmark revenues, no Treasury earmarks revenues, because it introduces fiscal rigidities within your system. And I think the other reason also, it's not a good idea for you to earmark your revenues, even it's over 50 or 20 years. What happens is, I think Tatiana alluded to that, if you price your carbon efficiently, the emissions are going to decrease over time. If you've earmarked the revenue for a particular project, how are you going to fund it going forward? So we don't advise earmarking, but we have indicated projects that we want to support going forward. So for example, we've got an energy efficiency tax incentive that was implemented in 2013, because we're hoping to implement the tax by 2015. So it was the carrot for the stick, but it came in earlier. So we actually support our industry, and that's part of the carbon tax revenues goes to support that particular incentive. And in this slide, it's just showing the different emissions allowances that apply to the different category of emissions. So you find that combustion is a much lower tax-free, a maximum tax-free thresholds of 90, because you can substitute the fuels that you use for combustion. But for process and fugitive, it's very hard. They're very hard to abate sectors. So we don't, we offer them a much higher tax-free threshold. So in terms of the total design of the carbon tax, this is what it looks like. Everyone gets a basic 60% threshold. So when we designed the tax, I think we're one of the first few countries to design a very complicated tax like this, but we're looking at the emissions trading system, and we wanted to mimic the design of the emissions trading system. So they provide tax-free allowances or the auction. So we wanted to mimic that particular structure. So we've got a 60% basic tax-free threshold that applies to everyone. And then a maximum of 10% for the trade exposure allowance I talked to. We also have a 10% tax-free allowance for either the fugitive and the industrial emissions, because they are hard to mitigate sectors. So we had to give them that extra cushion. And then we also have an emissions intensity metric within the design of the tax. So we ask our industry to develop benchmarks as a sector. And when you have a benchmark, if as a company you do better than the benchmark, you can get up to a 5% performance allowance. All these percentages are as a percent of your total emissions that you report. And then our Department of Environment is implementing or is still designing a carbon budget that they want to apply to certain companies. So as part of us getting data as government, we are incentivizing them to use, to supply data to Department of Environment. We give them the 5% tax-free threshold. In the carbon offsets, I've talked, so we allow the CDM, the Verified Carbon Standard, and the Gold Standard projects that were developed in South Africa to supply credits as long as they are not within the taxable activities. So if you've got projects in waste, in Afolu, you can use those to reduce your emissions. And combustion emissions have up to 10% tax-free allowance. Process and fugitive emissions can only use up to 5% of their tax-free allowance as offsets. So in terms of revenue recycling, I think on your right are the things we want we are sort of supporting, but we're not earmarking our revenue. So in terms of modeling, we had a modeling study. We've had several modeling studies done by the IMF, by our own national treasury, by the World Bank. What it shows is this is the latest study that was done in 2016, because the ones that were done before that didn't have the carbon tax design. This one used the carbon tax design that we currently have. So it's sort of indicated that we could reduce our emissions by 33% by 2035, beyond compared to business as usual. And it will have a very marginal impact on growth. So of about 0.05 to 0.15% percentage points compared to business as usual. So if economy was supposed to grow at 2%, with the carbon tax, what it showed is it will probably grow at 1.95% by 2035, which is a very minimal impact. So in terms of the challenges we faced, there were double taxation concerns. So we've got a renewable energy project program where independent power producers supply electricity into the grid, and there is a levy that the energy producers have to pay because we guarantee, it's a guaranteed return on the independent power producers that government has. And because we implement that particular, I guess, levy, there was a feeling that if we impose then a carbon tax, it will probably result in double taxation issues. And although this carbon tax is an explicit tax on emissions, the IPP levy and the other environmental levies are implicit. So we had to balance that, which is why we then agreed to an electricity price neutrality commitment. And in terms of industry competitiveness, although we give a trade exposure allowance, industry still felt they will be prejudiced and there will be carbon leakage. But I think now with the growing number of net zero commitments and carbon pricing around the world, those fears are sort of getting allayed. And in terms of human and institutional capacity, there were issues on that, and we're still working on it as a government, getting to capacitate ourselves so we can handle, because the offset mechanism currently applies, we allow waste and follow, but going forward in terms of the Article 6 negotiation, we see our carbon offset allowance becoming maybe the base for us for a market mechanism where we can engage with other countries through ITMOs or whatever other mechanism that will come out of the Article 6 negotiation. And the fact that we don't explicitly earmark revenue is a big issue for some stakeholders, but we have reasons why we don't. And I think growing unemployment, so when 85% of your electricity comes from coal production, we've got certain areas within the country that are just coal areas. So we are working on a just transition plan to make sure we don't create ghost towns and we get those workers into renewable linked employment. So those are some of the big issues we faced. And I think in terms of the lessons, when we go to parliament, there'll always be advocacy that you need to plan for. And you find that those with money who can actually advocate and influence the political process happen to be the fossil fuel linked companies. So you need to make sure you resist that. You need to make sure when you go out, you've got your principles and the reason why you are making the decision to implement a particular pricing instrument. You need to focus and stick to those principles even in the face of opposition. It helps when you stick to the same message. Eventually, they will understand why, because there will be a lot of pushback and lobbying. And in terms of the parliamentarians, the CEOs, most of them didn't understand carbon pricing. So it might be good as a communication strategy to start with educating people, especially the people that make decisions, on what you mean by carbon pricing. You don't mean you're going to kill industry, you're going to kill jobs, but you are putting a price for a particular reason. And you need to ensure there's balanced representation during your consultation processes, so they just don't hear the ones that can afford to be heard. And you could also reframe the text and put forward the benefits that you get. So the health benefits in terms of a cleaner environment and all are very visible, especially in terms of local air pollution, because when you reduce your greenhouse gases, you also reduce local air pollution. So that could be a selling point. And also, what are the alternative jobs that could be created as you transition to renewables? And for us, we also process the bill jointly with the Department of Environment. That really helped to also sort of nullify the effects of lobbying. And I've spoken to focusing on the benefits as well, and get other countries that have implemented the tax or the emissions trading scheme to come and share their experiences. So we had, at that time when we were facing a lot of opposition, we had mining union from Australia, because remember, Australia had implemented a carbon price. They came to South Africa to talk to our union, the mining union in South Africa, and help explain to them how they got a lot of, concessions from the Australian government. So that helps if you use, I guess, peer experience and try and use the system that already exists. Because for us, an emissions trading scheme, in terms of capacity, in terms of the new systems that needed to be implemented, it would have taken us even longer to implement. But a tax, because we've got an already strong excise tax system, we've got an mandatory emissions reporting system. We used those particular systems for us to be able to piggyback on them and implement the tax. So I guess in conclusion, even though you're still exploring, I would say a business as usual scenario is no longer plausible. There is need for countries, especially developing countries, for us to price our carbon, even if it's at a very low rate, and you sort of increase it over time. You just need to implement, and you can adjust as you go forward. You'll never have perfect conditions for you to implement. It's a learn by doing exercise is what we found. And I think with the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the net zero commitments, it's going to be harder to operate without carbon pricing in the carbon constrained world. And we still feel a carbon tax is an important instrument because it has unlocked a lot of abatement within our country, and also in terms of policies that are following suit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Memory. That was really very interesting. I'm very glad that you included the issue of communicating and engaging with national stakeholders to, as you say, allay the fears of transition. I think that's a really important point. I just first have some questions from participants for some points of clarification. So first, maybe with for you, Memory, a question from Suriname, from Gina in Suriname. How do you actually monitor the emissions so that you can tax precisely?
Thanks, Valerie. So as I indicated, we have a mandatory emissions reporting system that's run by the Department of Environment. And I think they followed the IPCC recommendations for national inventories. But what we've discovered is I think our stakeholders were reporting manually for like 3 years. Then in 2019, we then implemented an online reporting system, and that has made it much easier for them to report. And we've also developed regulations in terms of verification of the emissions, where, you know, if you report your emissions over time, the emissions reporting unit almost knows how much Valerie Enterprises emissions are. So if you have any deviation from that, that would trigger an audit. So for every emissions reporting period, it's for 3 months. When you report your emissions, you also need to report if there have been any changes in terms of production, or if you've added any new, you know, plants and all. So that's how you monitor them. And you also make sure that the emissions that they report to the Department of Environment are the same emissions they report to the Revenue Service. So if there is a mismatch there, it has to be explained. And I think they say within 4% of the emissions deviation, they are fine. Anything beyond that would trigger an audit. And we've got verification guidelines on how we go about verifying the emissions. And as I indicated, the emissions with the threshold are the combustion. So it's mostly combustion emissions that you will need to verify, because the fugitive and the process emissions, you have to report everything. There's no threshold. So anyone who conducts certain activities has to report. And we also make spot visits to the companies to just look at their processes and verify the emissions. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Tatiana, do you have any other examples to cite of monitoring? Or is that, if there's anything to add, I think that was just
No, just in the sense that, you know, the design option that you will have with your carbon tax will lead you to greater requirement in human resources or lesser requirements. So usually the best practice approach, and I don't mean best practice in the sense that it's better or worse, but it's usually indicated for countries with little human resources to verify and to check emissions, like memory is mentioning, to employ carbon taxes at the upstream level, because obviously it is much easier to verify the emissions from one producer, which is either the extractive industry or the importer, than it is to check every single installation that you have in your country. So for countries with little human resources and with inability to do this MRV process, which is the monitoring, review, and verification process, it would be more indicated to have the application of the tax at the upstream level, just because it's less complex and it's less costly as well, because it requires less use of human resources within the tax administration. So the two, also, you know, for that same reason, you know, we have more countries employing carbon taxes at the upstream than we do at the downstream level or midstream level. We have South Africa and Chile employing them at the midstream or downstream level, and all the other carbon tax examples we have to date are upstream carbon taxes, and that's basically because it's less human intensive in the MRV process.
But I guess in the case of South Africa, Memory was explaining that it was concentrated emitters, so it made it easier to do it at the downstream or midstream level.
Right, and ultimately countries will be specific. So countries will have to look at their own circumstances and see what is best for them. In Chile as well, the reason why they employed it at the downstream level was because Chile, actually, the big cities, they're concentrated in valleys. And so they had heavy accumulation of particulate matter where the big cities were, because obviously that's where most of the emissions are generated. And that environment didn't have a lot of air circulation because they are located in these valleys. So for Chile, it made sense to apply them at the installation level, the tax, because they were also trying to stimulate the energy producing entities to install filters of particular particulate matter in order to reduce those tiny particles in the atmosphere and to improve the general health of the population. So again, it's a very particular reason why a country would adopt a tax at the midstream and downstream. And also Chile wanted to eventually migrate into an ETS system or have that in concomitance with the ETS. And like Memory just highlighted, if you have a tax at the midstream or downstream level, you actually are able to harness data that is needed in order to eventually put forward an ETS. So these are all very specific reasons why countries would choose to go that way. But they are for reasons other than efficiency or easiness of administration. They are because of the particular reasons of the country. So it will be up to every country to assess what is the best for them.
Thanks. I think as you were both speaking, I was thinking about what is in the interest of an emerging oil and gas producer. What are the incentives and the disincentives of setting aside the ETS model, because as you said, Tatiana, it's more of a second phase, but thinking in terms of the carbon tax. Now, I think, from incentives, one of the things that you outlined was the fact that as the EU is setting up a system to tax carbon on imports of gas from the US and other countries that may not be controlling methane leakages, there's an incentive for an oil and gas emerging producer country to tax their own emissions, so that those revenues, that income goes to them and not to Europe, not to the EU, and assuming that more jurisdictions start to follow suit and follow the EU in that direction. So that's an incentive. Another one is, of course, to reduce your GHGs, or your greenhouse gas emissions, as Memory was outlining. And then, as Memory also said, it's like preparing for the world when carbon is priced and you already have the systems and you already have like a framework for pricing carbon in your country. But then in terms of disincentives, it seems that when you're an upstream, when you're looking at taxing carbon in the upstream, there is that risk of business going elsewhere, more so than if you already have discoveries, because as Tatiana was saying, there's less risk of once the investment is in place, there's much less risk of the investor going next door. But one thing I'd like to discuss a little bit is whether it really is a disincentive for investors when it's exploration, at the exploration stage, because oil companies are increasingly expecting carbon pricing, and having more certainty about it may actually be an incentive for investment. So that's a bit of a question I have. And I don't know if another disincentive might be the inequality issues that you penalize poor consumers, but I think Memory has really explained nicely how those kinds of concerns could be alleviated in South Africa. So maybe just turning over to you, I mean, responding a bit to my characterization of the, what would be whether this would be of interest and beneficial to an emerging producer, and how to mitigate some of those disincentives that I outlined. I don't know, Tatiana, do you want to respond first?
Yeah, I think the data we get from the oil and gas industry in general is that they're not looking at the world not being reliant on oil and gas in the short term. I mean, there's a very, I think it's become famous, a case law that just came out of the Netherlands now, that it commits Shell into paying into reducing its global carbon dioxide emissions by 40% due to its practices, and it links it to the pollution, to the effects of the pollution that is issued globally, and its effects on the Wadden region, which is a small region in the Netherlands in the North Sea. And so because of the effects that the world is feeling out of climate change and the effects in this particular region in the Netherlands, the court actually caused Shell to actually have a policy to reduce global emissions by 40%. And you reading through the documents from these companies, you see that they are still they're still expecting the world to be reliant on fossil fuels for the next 50 years. And so it's not something that they would stop an exploration project because of the imposition of a carbon tax. It might be that down the line, they would probably consider that difficult sites like deep sea oil exploration might not be economically viable for them. But right now, we're not at that stage yet. And the stage we're at is one of net carbon emissions, zero net carbon emissions, which means that you don't stop producing carbon emissions, but rather you try to compensate the emissions that you release in one place with the absorption of release of emissions in a different place. So basically compensation projects where overall companies will reach a net zero result. In terms of carbon emissions. So I think that's really, it's not something that would actually currently stop companies from introducing projects in developing countries. The second point would be that, as a member of the UN Subcommittee on Environmental Taxation and having worked in this manual on carbon taxation, we had a counterpart from Shell and one from Repsol also in the subcommittee. And these companies, they tend to favor carbon taxes over market-based approaches, basically because they're less complex. And so they would result in less compliance-based costs for the companies globally. So you see an interest of these companies in having countries adopt carbon taxes over market-based approaches, because again, market-based approaches are highly complex. It requires a lot of monitoring, and that's all leading to a cost for these companies. So you see more and more these companies also standing on the side of carbon taxation, which means that it's something that they expect to be developed over time. And that's something that always, also in the communications that they have to their shareholders, they express that. And they are always, if there is interest from governments in knowing how these companies stand with respect to the imposition of carbon tax, just reads the reports that they issue for their shareholders, and they will always say what they expect to be happening in the short, mid, and long-term basis in terms of their investments and whether they're feasible and whether they have an interest in maintaining them. And that's all freely available online. So, it's open. It's an open resource for those that are interested that are concerned with losing foreign direct investments. Did I answer your question? Did I miss any points?
Yeah. No, that's perfect. Thanks so much, Tatiana. Memory, what about you? How do you feel about the characterization of incentives and disincentives?
Thanks, Valerie. I think I'll echo Tatiana's, points. So for us, I guess as a tax policy unit, part of the studies like our corporate tax unit has done is looking at what factors investors look at for them to, invest in a country. And you find that taxation is like the third most. There are other factors that they actually look at in terms of how is the ease of doing business and such things. So, and I think what Tatiana was also alluding to is in terms of, so when we wanted to implement a carbon tax, I think one of the oil companies, it's a major oil company, was always supporting us. Why? When you impose a carbon tax, you sort of give them the price path. They are very happy with the price path. They want to know, and it makes it easier for them to model. And what is also happening is, in as much as we talk of a carbon tax, a lot of companies now have an internal carbon price, which some of them actually have priced at $100 per ton, which is way higher than what we have. So you find that as the debate is shifting and everyone is being asked to look at the climate risks, a lot of these companies are actually pricing carbon within to look, and some of them use it to look at the point where they shift. And I think the latest IEA EA report that talked about we shouldn't actually take out what's in the ground and all. But one of the things is, the reality is, I think they say the oil will probably peak around 2030, like we'll still have oil until then. And the use of carbon capture, use and storage is something that they actually advocate for. So you find that a lot of companies, some are looking at storage in terms of renewables, but a lot of them are also looking at that CCUS, how you capture the emissions, either use them for other processes or find a way of disposing of them. Because the transition, we're not going to get off the oil, you know, in 5 years' time. It's going to take a bit of time for us to transition out of it. And I think, so I still think it actually is not an incentive. It's actually gets a lot of FDI coming in because it shows a government that's committed. It shows policy certainty when you have a carbon price, because if you don't have it now, or you're not talking about it, it makes them wonder what's going to happen if we invest and then in 5 years' time we're told there's going to be, you know, a carbon price. So it actually is to your advantage to have it upfront as a government and say, these are the environmental policies, and looking at what's happening globally, a lot of investors will actually be glad to have that policy certainty, and they will want to invest. Thanks.
Yeah, well put. Thanks, Memory. If participants are able to stay on 5 extra minutes, and yourselves as well, the speakers, that would be great, just to take 2 more questions. There was a question for Tatiana, or just to explain what is the relevance of you mentioned the WTO and GATT rules, and why is this relevant to this issue? Maybe just to explain what's at stake there. And then also for you, Tatiana, do you have any, is there any data on how carbon tax implementation has impacted income for developing countries or affected foreign direct investment? Like, is there any kind of tracking of the impact? And I guess that could also be answered in the case of South Africa, whether you were able to track it in the country in terms of the GDP impact. But you maybe didn't mention the income generated from the, unless I missed it, from the tax. And then another question from Memory is, what were in implementing this carbon tax framework, what were the key contributors to helping you implement this process? How did you deal with internal disagreements and misalignments, especially within government? So Memory, do you want to start first? Maybe just since the question is freshest in your mind.
Thanks, Tatiana, and thank you for the question. So in terms of, I'll start with the income from the carbon tax. That's kind of difficult, I guess, for us to sort of give out the figures. Why? Because in terms of the design, there's a lot of tax-free allowances that apply per activity, so different companies. And our first tax filing period was from 1 June to 31 December 2019, and they only filed their taxes in October, which was like a half-year tax year. So we haven't gotten the final figures from the Revenue Authority in terms of how much, and 2020 won't be a representative year because of this whole COVID and whatever. But it wasn't a lot of revenue, I guess, in terms of, because of the tax-free allowances. We were not sure how much companies were going to. So unfortunately, I don't have a figure for that. And then in terms of the key contributors, so yes, we are a treasury that decided to implement a carbon tax. So we went ahead of the Department of Environment in terms of the mitigation policy instruments. They have a carbon budget allowance, which they want to implement as a mitigation policy mechanism. So for us, I guess the debate was slightly different. We were the Minister of Finance pushing for a carbon price versus, I guess, other countries where the Minister of Environment or the Minister of Energy is the one that's pushing for a price and you're getting resistance from your Treasury. We did it the other way around. But one of the major things that helped us was to do, like I indicated, joint, go out as a government. So make sure the policies that are implemented by other departments align with the carbon pricing initiative, so that when you go out as a government, there's no, you're not sending different messages in terms of what you're saying. And it was also, I guess, getting people on the ground that actually live in the communities. As I indicated, we've got communities that are just codependent. Getting people from those particular communities be able to come into parliament and tell parliamentarians the air pollution they face, you know, the everyday things that other people don't see in terms of, and be able to share that experience really helped us. And also, I guess, sticking to the principle of we are pricing an externality, which is in line with the polluter pays principle, which is enshrined in our National Environmental Management Act, which is within the Constitution. That really helped us. We're not deviating from the Constitution. This is for the greater good. So stick to the principles. There will be a lot of lobbying, but, and also be willing to compromise. So they will come, don't shut people out, talk to them and find a compromise if you can, so you get buy-in for your policy. Thanks.
Thanks, Memory. That's very, very practical and real world advice for the governments in our group. Tatiana, in just a couple minutes, what's your, do you want me to repeat the questions? They were a little.
No, I got it. Okay. So I think in terms of revenue collection, we actually have quite extensive data, obviously not coming from developing countries because these countries have only just recently introduced carbon taxes, but the developed countries, particularly Sweden, Finland, they actually issue quite a bit of data on the implementation and the increase of carbon tax rates vis-a-vis their GDP. And the data is very interesting, particularly coming from Sweden. You can go into the Swedish website and you're gonna see a few reports on those issues. And they show how, as the carbon tax rate increased over time, they were also able to increase their GDP and not lose investment. Obviously, that's the context of that country is very different from many of your own countries. But it shows that it is possible to administer a carbon tax at the same time as you are able to also increase your economic situation. And the example that we get probably from middle income countries in Latin America, when we hear them speak, is that there wasn't any loss in investment opportunities in the countries. And that's because, you know, these are also carbon sink based countries. So industries that are located there are very interested in being there because there are many environmental opportunities to be gained in being there. And also because their carbon taxes, as I said, sometimes they're small, like Memory mentioned, like the carbon tax rates are small and there are other incentives. So the initial burden is not so heavy as to affect investment ability into a jurisdiction. So, and that's actually the advice: start small, see how companies react, how your investors react, and then move along in increasing that tax rate and reducing the incentives that you have to have them over time. Many South American countries employ offsets approaches, like Memory mentioned. So if you do something to reduce your emissions, you get a discount in your carbon tax rates. It's also an approach in order for you to deal with the needs of your particular investors. As long as you start, you know, it's like starting, it's like being a first-time home acquirer. You have to get into the markets and then you move forward. And in terms of the WTO implications, those concern mostly the admission of border tax adjustments. And particularly that discussion is now happening with respect to the EU proposal to introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is, a fancy name to say it's a border tax adjustment. And it's a border tax adjustment that is that corresponds to the price that is employed by the EU under the EU ETS system. So under their common market-based approach. There are several WTO implications, basically because you have to be compliant with the GATT, which is the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. And the GATT says that you cannot discriminate against third countries. That's, I think, in Article 3 of the GATT. And so probably a border tax adjustment, whatever the nature it is, it would be discriminatory against third countries because obviously you're employing a price that is only applicable to third countries. But then you have certain exceptions that are included in Article 20. And one of those exceptions are exceptions that are related to the environment. And the dispute settlement body has already said that if your objective is to protect clean air, then that measure would be admissible as long as it's broadly compatible with an equal burden that is employed domestically. So it doesn't have to be absolutely the same price domestically and at the border, but it has to be roughly similar. And the objective has to be to protect an environmental commons such as clean air. So with respect to a carbon tax, it is pretty clear in the jurisprudence that a border tax adjustment with respect to a carbon tax would be admissible, but it's not absolutely clear that a CBAM type measure, so a border price that is compatible with an emissions trading system would be admissible. And that's because there has never been anything similar happening around the world yet, and we don't have jurisprudence to support that. Although many trade specialists say that a carbon price is substantially similar to a tax, so they kind of do the same thing. And they are kind of trying to protect the same commons. So you could extend the rationale of the dispute settlement body with respect to taxes to the application of market-based mechanisms. But again, we would have to have a dispute, and we would have to see how the dispute settlement body decides on those questions, or if there is a position from the WTO. So there is a little bit of gray ground there, but in general, you have to look at WTO implications to see whether it's admissible.
Thanks, Tatiana. That's so interesting. Really a new and evolving space. But as you've both pointed out, I think today, there are definite trends moving ahead, especially in the developed world, on that are really pushing for carbon pricing, and several of the developed countries are starting to take advantage of that. And constraining companies also in what they should be expected to make as commitments under this. So I think what we've heard is really some very interesting mechanisms for emerging producers to position themselves smartly and early in this evolving space. And also some of the challenges in getting that implemented and overcoming some of the resistance that might happen nationally, which can't be underestimated. So I think this has been fascinating. We've taken more time than we were supposed to, so I don't want to extend any further, but thank our participants for staying on, and really thank our speakers for a fascinating webinar. I think it was extremely instructive, new topics for myself. And so this webinar will be available on the New Producers Group website as a resource for all the participants in the training that we're doing, but then also just generally going forward, I think it'll be a really useful resource for the governments of our group. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to our speakers, and see you on June 17th for the next webinar.